Hugh Ellis, who I first knew about 17 years ago, because I used to be involved in Defence of the Earth nationally, and he was the Defence of the Earth planning person. Yes. So he was great then. And then somebody told me, oh, the Town and Country Planning Association's got a really good speaker about climate change. And I looked it up and I said, oh, I know him. So I invited him along to come to this, which I'm very pleased about. So, do you want to? So he now works for the Town and Country Planning Association, who are, you might want to say.
I'll say who we are because no one will know who the hell we are, which is understandable. So I am I could just about still claim to be a middle-aged planner. I'm going to say a little bit about planning endeavour and climate change, a little bit about the TCPA. But I was slightly conscious also that you might have local issues that you want to talk about and explore. I know we've raised some of them, been raised already about increased housing numbers and what that does on climate resilience. So to some extent, if you want to take that in whatever direction you want to, for at least part of the session, that seems like one of the most useful things. Just to say who the Town and Country Planning Association is, well, there are two ways of looking at that. There are two professional bodies for planning, and we're one of them, but we're the junior partner, so we're not the trade union, that's the Royal Town Planning Institute. We are what's left of the British utopian tradition. And we're a small minority sport, and it's interesting actually how it's kind of slightly divided, isn't it? Planning used to be part of the ideals around the environment movement, and now that's kind of been lost quite a lot. So the TCPA was formed in the 1890s. It was formed around radical assessment of land ownership, around the principle that people should be allowed to live in extraordinary communities which enhance their life, health and well-being, and everything from local food, local energy production to new forms of democracy were all wrapped up in that. We built two places. We built Letchworth Garden City and Welling Garden City. Letchworth still is a self-financing place based on the economic model we developed, so Utopia was there, and then we found a way of funding it. And there's still tremendous interest in that model. That's the Garden City ideal. For those of you who I've already spoken to thinking about garden villages, I want to make it clear that the government's Garden Village programme has nothing to do with the ideals that we promote. If you want to see what those ideals are, they're on the TCPA website, and they're an interesting idea. So what do? We campaign on climate change, we campaign on housing, principally these days on social justice. That's led us into some training and work with JRF and Climate Just, so we have those connections. We spend a lot of our time with parliamentarians and government, and they spend a lot of time ignoring us. So it's a really interesting time, really desperate time, I think, for England, desperately badly organised nation, as a result critically unprepared for climate change, and as a result of that requiring radical change at all levels. And our job as an organisation is to think about national planning, regional, local, and neighbourhood planning, and try and join that together. We're currently undertaking the Rainsford review with Nick Rainsford, which means I'm somewhere else every day around England talking to people about how planning should operate. But I want you to distinguish between, or I would suggest, between planning as we think it should be and its immense capability to make people's lives better, and planning as it is in terms of government reform, which is a complete basket case. The two things are very, very different. And the question for all of you, for me too, is do you want to be Detroit or Copenhagen? Does England want to be, what does it want to be? It could be either of those two things. At the moment, it's pretty determined to be Detroit without the urban farming. So in that sense, it's a lot at stake. This piece of research, and there are some copies here, probably not one for everyone. There was 3 minutes ago, but then lots of people not interested in planning. It's on our website. This piece of research we did about a year ago for JRF, based on looking at local plans and their content on climate change. And the quick summary about that is that the local plan framework, and I can describe a bit around that for those of you who want to in a second. On the whole, local plans are just not doing what they need to do in relation to climate change. Let's be really clear about that. They're not fulfilling their legal requirements. I can talk about that. But more importantly, they're not fulfilling the requirements. They're not fulfilling the requirement to reduce emissions, and they are not fulfilling the requirement to build resilience in the complex ways that you need to do that. And just to describe why that is, a lot of it is the lack of proper targets and evidence in local plans on the issue. And a lot of that's got to do with the fact that central government has stripped out the capacity of local government, so that many small district councils don't have enough basic capacity in their planning teams to be able to think properly. And certainly not far from here, there are planning authorities with 1.25 full-time equivalent planners trying to write their local plans in the face of really serious climate change threats. At the same time, we've got a demographic crisis as we've got a climate crisis. So there is a desperate need for new homes and particularly affordable homes. Of course, affordability now, government's definition is totally meaningless. So what do we mean properly by that? Well, things like social rent tenures. And there's an important need for those to meet that affordability by building new homes and building new places, as well as the regeneration imperative. Depends where you live in the country, of course, but the government's current policies attempt to cram everyone into the southeast of England, broadly. But there is a major housing crisis, and so there's a question about how we deal with that. Do we deal with it in highly sustainable ways or piecemeal, fragmented ways? And then what does that mean for how we respond to climate change? I think just in terms of where we are at the moment, this is a country with no national plan, to be clear, unlike most other European countries. It has a series of ad hoc national policy statements at the top. Things like the national policy statement for ports is really helpful. It says ports should be by the sea. Remarkable. I felt overjoyed to hear. But the national policy statements are all prepared for energy and big infrastructure stuff by different government departments and not expressed in a single spatial strategy. What do I mean by that? It's not on a bloody map. So you can't tell what goes well where. Treasury and others are pushing to try and do that. But at the same time, of course, they're employing economic models, which you've been discussing today, have real serious issues around the climate debate. Below that, in 2010, they abolished regional planning. Absolute disaster for climate change. One of the greatest mistakes this nation has ever made, equivalent to smashing up your radar set in an aircraft flying towards a mountain. Because what regional planning did was provide expertise, details and data at the right spatial scale. I know this language is planning language, what the hell do I mean by it? You just can't organise things for climate change just on a local basis. Neither is it just about a national basis. An intelligent nation has a conversation, isn't it, between all of those tiers, but you've got to organise things on a catchment scale. And I know the debates you've been having today, a little bit, planning of course can't deal with upland land use issues at all because it doesn't control agriculture. So it doesn't do what it needs to do in terms of taking command and control of important issues around upland catchment issues and land use. So that means that all you've got is your local plan. And presumably, is anyone involved in the local plan, apart from those people writing them? A few people, yeah, sort of, yeah. And the local plan is the development plan, so in theory that's the legal framework. National Planning Policy Framework is the document the government uses to try and influence that. And we've also got a very, apart from a very demoralised planning service, got a system that's much weaker. So final couple of points. The system is much weaker than it's ever been. So permitted development's been extended. That means you can build a lot more kinds of places and convert them without planning permission. And you've also got prior approval, which is a form of planning permission, but it basically means that you can convert large numbers of offices to houses without the ability to make them places where people want to live. So there's 2 or 3 things you can think about, and one of those is flood risk. But for example, in London, if you convert an office block into housing, you can't think about all the other important resilience measures that might help reduce it. Green infrastructure, for example, greening buildings, all things that help with temperature reduction you can't do. You can't get any educational contributions, you can't even get any children's play space. Fifth largest economy on earth is turning out a quality of development which is shockingly poor in every sense. Rooms that are too small, buildings that are not resilient, building essentially slums of the future. And we've done this before, so we've got form on this. Everyone remembers the high-rise programmes. Post-Grenfell Tower, we've all been thinking really hard about whether we've got a planning system that's for people, or whether we've got a planning system that operates for developers. And it's an interesting question, that. Not sure what the answer is, but on the whole, it's certainly not delivering the outcomes that we need. So there are 2 things at work here. One, planning's got the potential to deliver great places, but it's not doing that, and it's partly not doing that because I think public understanding of planning is at a really low level as well, actually, at the moment. So, for example, we're doing some fantastic stuff on human health and planning, and would you believe it? You know, if you have a view, it actually helps your mental health. Well, no. I mean, amazing, isn't it? Things that we knew intuitively 100 years ago, we've got an incredible evidence base now about how the built environment affects people's well-being in all sorts of ways. And yet you're creating student accommodation in London with rooms with no windows. I saw 60 flats being converted in my home county of Derbyshire, which is not most of it. I suppose it's a bit like this. It's not all a high demand area, if you know what I mean. There are hot spots in it, but on the whole it's not a high demand area. 60 flats converted, none of the bedrooms had windows. There's no requirement, you know, in law to have a window. And that's very important, because if you're not careful, you build a division between the needs of people and the needs of environment, which is totally false. I can't tell you how false that is. In fact, both things are mutually dependent, obviously. And actually you can build great places that really enhance people's well-being and life chances, or you can do the opposite. The question is, a place like Lancaster with all its resilience issues, what are you going to build and how can you build it? One plea for planners, because I know there are one or two people in the room, their lives are really hard at the moment. They've lost powers, they've been kicked around by the government, they've been told they're the enemy of enterprise, and they've been told that their profession is meaningless. Let me tell you, they're one of the most important groups of people out there, although to some extent we're all planners, aren't we? We all plan. The question is not whether there's a plan or not, the question is whose is the plan. Is it going to be a public plan, a democratic plan, or is it going to be somebody else's plan? So that's an end-to-end of where we are in England, and it's not it's a picture in two halves. Planning's got enormous potential to make us better. And we could talk about the detailed measures if you like, so we can go through those. But it's also in England at the moment in a very poor state to actually deliver change. And largely that means it's about development of housing units, the allocation of units, not building places. Any thoughts or questions, or any places any direction people want to go in, and we can explore any issue you would like in all of that rich fruitcake. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I know you've got this general overview thing, but there are presumably areas where things are moving more in the right direction rather than less so. What can we use those to sort of try and focus energy and direction into the things that you want to see resolved?
Yeah, there are one or two places doing well. I'll give you quick examples of that. I mean, London, outstandingly, the London plan is still the place where most of the innovation takes place. So we're hearing a lot about temperature in Paris. How many local plans have you read have got policies on temperature in them? Because when we did this research, apart from London, one or two of the cities beginning to think about it, none of them have. And yet you can take at least 2 to 3 degrees off the temperature of the city by deploying green infrastructure, and the University of Southampton did some fantastic research around that. So there are good examples, but honestly, the best examples are Europe. Europe's so far ahead of us on the built environment. I'm not going to go any further with my comments about Europe, except to say they are ahead of us and we have a tremendous amount to learn. And if you look at what other European cities are doing, particularly I think in relation to temperature and transport, sustainable transport, way ahead of anything we're doing. In this country though, there are some authorities doing some good stuff, so there are one or two beginning to plan for where floodplains will be, not where they are.
Like?
Bristol. Brighton, for example, still holding out for code level 4, standards. We lost, things that were abolished, zero carbon commitment, code for sustainable homes. On and on since 2010, there has been this vandalism to standards in the built environment. And I'm choosing my words carefully because I could be much stronger if I was telling the absolute truth. But it's easy to smash things up. It's really great. It's very hard to put them back. So in terms of our standards and delivery on a whole range of issues, and you could also see that in relation to energy. So without creating any offence to anyone's particular views, it's impossible to deploy onshore wind, and impossible virtually to oppose fracking. Now that policy environment makes the planning system completely illegitimate in the eyes of the public. Why is one energy source treated in one way and another energy source treated in another? And that's very foolish of government to do that. But there are good examples out there, and there are one or two good examples of places being delivered, but there is no technical barrier to delivering highly resilient, energy positive places. It's just all that technology is out there, and it's just absolutely fantastic. But most of it's being deployed in other countries. And there's some positive stuff like, photovoltaics now becoming deployable without subsidy, and you can't believe the boom that's going on in that. But for energy planning, there's also a boom in diesels in fields. Has anyone seen that? It's extraordinary.
Or wood burners in empty sheds where they just open the doors and get paid loads of money to run the wood burner.
Well,
you don't know about that?
That's with the OHI.
Yeah.
I think the way they did it in England, it doesn't really encourage that.
I know somebody who worked in the field and in the area, and that is not true. They could do it by attaching a radiator and having a blower on it, and that's what they have been doing.
I'm going to be relieved to say, no, I don't know anything about it, because it sounds remarkable. But that, yeah.
Sorry, I'm very interested in housing estates and flooding, especially on rivers and in river valleys.
So that's the big issue we face when people talk about development on floodplains. Well, we have developed quite a lot on floodplains, and if you look at what the Committee on Climate Change Adaptation Subcommittee, 2 great reports on their website look at that issue, both of them quite worrying. And I think 10 or 11% of the housing we've deployed in the last 10 years has been Category 3 floodplains. But here's the thing about that I would be cautious about. It's not impossible to develop housing in vulnerable areas if the design here meets brilliant standards. And the Dutch are really good at this, and they've got great examples of how they're dealing, because they have to, in terms of how they're dealing with it. But I think on the whole, our approach to it has been to make our communities more vulnerable. There's more people living in them. And on the whole, the kind of quality of places we're building in floodplains is not dealing with that. I'll give you a quick example. In Leeds, there are 97 schemes when we did the research which employ sustainable urban drainage systems. Now, I'm a very stupid person, and I thought that sustainable urban drainage systems were green suds. So that is, you basically have a system you might have seen where water's dealt with on site through a series of channels and ponds, through green infrastructure. You get the multiple benefits of space for children, water, and dealing with water in a sustainable way. But of course, the legal definition of sustainable urban drainage is no such thing. Actually, what it means is a large concrete tank underneath the car park of the development that results in no net increase in outflow from the site. So out of the 97 sustainable urban drainage schemes in Leeds, 3 of them were green suds. All the rest of them employed that engineering solution, which is part of the legal definition. So this is, I mean, it's complicated enough, as we were saying, before we started. But that is a problem. It depends on whether you're holding feet to the fire about the kind of design standards you can get. And here's the problem, as you can know, in local planning. Buried in national government, well, it's not buried, it's the top test, is the viability test in the NPPF. And what the viability test says is you can't have any policy in the local plan that compromises the ability of landowners and developers to make competitive returns. Competitive returns are not defined. But if you think about what that does, that stands public interest planning on its head. You can't do anything that reduces my profit margin. What's your profit margin? It's whatever I think it should be. And of course, in volume house building, profit margins can vary from the late teens, but more often the mid-20s. So profit margins on housing development are between 20 and 30% normally, not everywhere. If you think about what do you pay on your gas bill for a utility in terms of profit margin? Pub quiz time.
5%.
Yeah, 5-6% for a utility. So people are making a lot of money out of the provision of housing, and particularly out of land values that go with the provision of housing, but not necessarily delivering what we need. 3 out of every 5 houses built by the private sector in this country are subsidised by you, the taxpayer, through Help to Buy and various other schemes. So it's worth reflecting. It does tend to annoy my colleagues. There is no private sector house building industry in this country. It's only there because taxpayers support it. And that means you would think that we would have a right to require good and high quality outcomes. But honestly, I'm walking around housing estates now that make me want to weep. In fact, I did weep walking around one of them the other day. It's just dreadful, and they are most dreadful for people on low incomes. So we've got a lot to do there, but it's possible. And the engagement about design is hard, isn't it? Because what happens in the average local plan is that the argument about design gets lost in the numbers game and the viability game, and the question about whether or not you want to live in a nice place is, well, often nowhere. So people need to push really hard. There are great examples of good design out there. They're all over the web, and there's plenty of places to pick them up. Push for them. Argue. It's a grim time for planning, but the only response to that is no surrender, as far as I'm concerned. You know, just don't take no for an answer. Push harder, question, and that drives up the standards.
I have to be more pessimistic than that as an ex-planner, believing entirely on that. I'm old enough to remember, I don't remember the Garden Village has been built, but go back. And I've seen how all the powers have been stripped away. And since I left planning, I've seen how housing developments have been allowed in Kendal near here on areas that should be holding water naturally and have been drained, and there was nothing in the regulations to stop them doing that at all, because they're not floodplains themselves. They're storage areas further up, and they don't have to do a pre-assessment of the site as to how much water was held by those schemes before they put in a SUDS, so-called, which actually only held up probably less water than was held up naturally, because they didn't have to assess the site beforehand. I've seen things kicked down, the cans kicked down the road on the drainage schemes, so that permission was given and then conditional on you getting a drainage scheme, and then I've seen drawings submitted which were incorrect, just passed by the authorities, because all the authorities have been taken apart completely by government. No drainage engineers in the districts, county council, the local flood authority, with very few drainage engineers of their own anyway, just training other people, so called, to tick the boxes. And trying now to stop my poorer area down near the river being flooded by houses that have been further up, all around Cumbrian towns. We're just getting absolutely nowhere, and I'm extremely depressed, and I don't know how hard you can fight when you get people, local people, taking information to appeals and being told if we needed to listen to local residents we wouldn't need drainage engineers.
Wow.
It's written in the inspector's report.
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
Now we've seen ourselves.
I don't disagree with the pessimism around where planning is at, but I also think we've got to have a way forward with it, and I also think that we're probably at the bottom of the pendulum swing on planning, and I'll tell you why I think that. Because, for example, I got summoned to be shouted at by Michael Gove and summoned to be shouted at by the Secretary of State for Planning on why are we building such poorly designed housing. To which my response was, well, Secretary of State, because you deregulated all the regulations around planning, get what you deserve. Post Grenfell Tower, and it's an awful shocking thing to think you have to kill that many people before people care about outcomes. There is a different attitude in government about design. I'm not saying that it won't take, 5 years to put planning back, maybe more, to rebuild it. Perhaps it'll take a decade. But the only option that I think that we've got on climate change, which has been massively deprioritised since 2010, no doubt about that. Yeah, absolutely. The only option that we've got is to try and build a new way of engaging and arguing with it. And I think that's partly about conversations in days like today. There is a phenomenon out there called planning by surrender, where planners are beaten up, local authorities are beaten down, and communities don't think there's a choice. Well, actually, on many of the issues and many of the detailed cases that you look at, actually, there were definite errors in what was done. So, question to you all, how many local plans have you got in your area that have an explicit carbon reduction target? Any local plan that doesn't is not lawful. And if I had the money, I'd judicially review all of them. The only reason they stand is because the planning inspectorate and planning inspectors, bless their cotton socks, don't understand that much about climate change. So if you look at that report, there's a full report on our website that goes with it. You can see a description of what those legal requirements are. And they're pretty clear. They're really clear in law. There are only 3 outcome duties in planning law: good design, sustainable development, climate mitigation and adaptation. Those are the 3 duties. There aren't any others, interestingly.
We don't have any powers to put them in place though. When I was writing the climate change chapter for the Cumbria Minerals and Waste local plan, we didn't have any powers to make anything happen.
And the MPPF says that you should write plans, footnote 16, in line with the provisions of the Climate Act. Provision 1 of the Climate Act is a carbon reduction target. It's all there. It's never been tested at law because, well, I don't ask, because richer NGOs than ours have never done it. All I'm saying to you is that you've got a choice, haven't you, I think, on this issue. Climate change is such an important social, political issue. We have to be able to make responses even when we're at the point of despair. And trust me, after 25 years of working in planning and climate change, I've certainly got a ticket for the despair train. But I don't think it's one that, I think it's one we can afford. I really don't. I think we've got to find ways through it. And there are ways through it, and they're interesting. Anyone doing neighbourhood planning? Neighbourhood planning, if you're not involved in it, neighbourhood planning was deeply sceptical about when it was first in. Did anyone listen to the Archers?
Yeah.
Oh, somebody else. So if you listen to the Archers, everyday story of country folk, is the idea, isn't it? And you listen to the debates they have. Neighbourhood planning was written by people who listened a lot to the Archers, because it's written for rural communities that are quite cohesive, as the Archers now, around parish councils. But the neighbourhood plan is a legally binding development plan. And although there were massive issues about its power going on, slowly it's gaining a little bit more power. So if you write a neighbourhood plan, you get 25%, for example, in community infrastructure levy to spend, which is, can be, depends on where you are, can be money. My advice is, despite my scepticism about them, and they are quite hard to get done, is that if you want to take control, if you want to have some say over the process, you've just got to try and use every instrument you can. Neighbourhood planning is there. There are 2,000 neighbourhood plans underway. I'm really surprised. There's a lot of money given out by government for those who want it. I think 25 million in this round going out there for neighbourhood plan to support neighbourhood planning. Centre for Sustainable Energy did a survey and found 3 of those plans have got anything on climate change in them. Now, whose fault's that? It's an open question, actually. You don't. The duties on planning don't apply to neighbourhood planning on climate change. So, in fact, they're just completely open to communities to do what they like. And and it's about energy, actually. It's about energy and will and morale. But if I had all of those things, I would get involved in the neighbourhood planning process. Which is not
put off the neighbourhood planning process because in this area, Janice Hanson, who was the head of the council at the time, said, and I think planning said as well, that if you engage with it, then you're engaging with the local plan to have houses built, whereas we were still under a process of consultation. So, and they've said again since then that they'd go back to those areas to put houses there. So it's almost like opening yourself up and going, yes, I will have your houses.
Well, it's a matter of fact, it's true that neighbourhood plans cannot allocate less houses in their area than the local plan does. But actually, the local plan's often not specific about areas, not as you say that, or that specific. So I don't think it's an either or. But given we're not dealing with perfect solutions, let's say, what have neighbourhood plans been doing really well? You can't argue with the numbers easily, so they can't do that well. What they have been doing is developing design codes, which have been standing up at appeal for the first time this year, where inspectors have gone in and said, well, developers come along and say, I'm going to build that there, and I'll build it to my 1 in 4 format that I've got as a volume house builder, and you can all get stuffed. And there's a neighbourhood plan, it says you need to do these design issues into it, and the inspector's gone, right, recognise the neighbourhood plan, you must do it like that. Now, I don't think that's not going to change the world, on the one hand, but it's something.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that the choice about neighbourhood planning, as I said, as a sceptic really about it, I'm beginning to change my mind, just because there's so little else, to get involved in. But you shouldn't not get involved in the local plan. You've got rights under the local plan as well. So, I'm not going to, as I was saying when the session started, the local plan requirement is going to change. They're going to rewrite the National Planning Policy Framework, well they are now, and that's going to be issued in the spring of 2018.
Is that the one with the figures in it? You know the new figures to working out the different districts?
It will be, although so there's a new housing forecasting regime, centralised housing forecasting regime, which for about half the local authorities, planning authorities in England, has put up their housing numbers by about 40%, but it can't put them up more than that.
That's in itself though, isn't it?
Almost all. And there are high demand patches, aren't there? If you're in the north, it's put figures down. And if you suggest to government that this might massively reinforce the north-south divide, you get shouted at a lot. But I mean, the difficulty with the housing numbers is there's genuine, real need out there. The question is how you meet it and where you meet it. Yeah.
But we're in a situation where we've got a plan for 675 houses per year. We've never built more than 400. The government's figures suggest 400, and we're having 675 put through. The result seems to us that because we're plus all the ones that we haven't built for the last however many years are being added to the number. So when we continue to build 400, which presumably is much what the demand is, then every time you don't fulfil your total number, does that not mean that developers can ask for basically other land?
Yeah, this is complicated, so prepare your brains to feel like you're getting a really bad headache at the end of the afternoon. But where your plan can't prove 5-year land supply in the plan, then the weight of the plan is reduced. This is so complicated in law because none of it's what it seems, but essentially you've got to have a 5-year land supply, or you risk having a presumption in favour of development. Let's be really clear, there's no definition of sustainable development in national government policy. It's an absolute joke. Then, if they're committed to sustainable development, I'm a banana. And one of the things we all need to do, you know, again, post-Grenfell and because we're people who care, is be much more honest. Don't sit in conversations where people talk about the planning system upholding sustainable development. As far as I'm concerned, having worked with it for a very long time, I know what the definition of sustainable development is, and it's not in the MPPF. But it means that you've got a problem on 5-year land supply. But the planning system allocates land. Does the planning system build homes? No. The rate of development, build-out rate, is almost always in the hands of the private sector. And they're competing, of course, with each other. So they want allocations, but they've no interest in building out on them at a fast rate. Why? Because if you built out at a fast rate beyond market demand, what would happen to prices?
Go down.
So there is no financial interest in the private sector building out, but the government cannot understand that because they're having a problem with how bright they are at the moment. They can't understand that proposition. So what they do is they inflict pain on local authorities, huge pain on local authorities, say allocate more land, but don't give the local authorities any way of delivering homes. Now, there is an enormous new movement out there suggesting that local authorities should start building council houses again and start setting up companies to build. And actually, mostly that's a really good idea because they can build at higher quality. You can have a say over it because they're a local authority. And places like Plymouth are doing that. They're building, you know, I think they've gone back to building Hoff houses in Plymouth, which is great.
Can I just come in on I think the problem is that with the over allocations, I see it, saying, you know, we need 600 a year when we only need 400, is that it means you get a load of greenfield sites developed. So we had a good local, what was it, the core, can't remember the terminology, I used to know all this, the core strategy was all about urban concentration and redeveloping, you know, sort of redeveloping brownfield sites. And I see that as being sort of kicked out effectively by this demand of the current government to just build almost at whatever cost. And if you think about, you know, in 2000, 2001, we had low demand areas. We had houses in Morecambe, you know, 5-bedroom houses going for £8,000 or less or something ridiculous. And, you know, skirting prices collapsing. And, you know, we could get that again at the rate that we're building at the moment. Lots of greenfield sites. And I've got a friend had a house on Regent Street, really nice house in Lancaster, so central Lancaster, really nice house, original features, all that. Real problem selling it. And I do wonder about, you know, whether, because what happens is that the new houses get sold, perhaps because partly this help to buy system supports people buying new houses. But then the old areas, terraced houses, you get a situation where the prices there start to fall. And then the BBC did a survey they produced recently. 58% or over half of the country house prices have fallen. So on the news, all we hear about is sort of London and the South East and, you know, house prices going through the roof. That's actually not the case for most people. Since 2007, house prices have stagnated or fallen.
Yeah. And we allocated 270,000 units of housing in England last year. And we built, or converted, we built 139,000 new builds. And the rest, we built 190,000 altogether, but the gap is filled by conversion. So we're allocating just ahead of actually what we need demographically, which is about 250,000, because population is real and it's changing fast. Whether it will change faster as a result of the last 2 years, I don't know. But again, it's possible to do it really well. The point I suppose that you're making is an important one, is that you end up allocating massive amounts of land, and then rather than phasing development to build communities, which is a core part of planning, you simply have the cherry picking of the sites that are most viable. You've got a brownfield register, so that's a new thing as well. All the sites brownfield register effectively have deemed planning permission now. But that doesn't solve any
Doesn't
kind of
that come
problem.
out in December? Sorry.
Yeah.
It comes back, that's December, isn't it?
I'm not sure if it is December, but is it December?
Deadline's 31st of December.
It's what?
Deadline's 31st of December.
Right.
And just in very broad terms, if the local authority has to come up with a register, has to put its brownfield sites on the register, they have permission in principle. In other words, you can develop them for housing. But the problem with brownfield sites is not planning permission, and it never was planning permission. It's about a multitude of other problems like remediation and various other things. There's a question there. Yeah.
changing the direction a little bit, looking to the future. Any sort of indications you've heard of the interaction between the National Planning Framework, the Climate Change Act, the local development plans, and the proposed 25-year environmental plan?
So, quick answer, no, because government's not that good. The longer answer, I think, is that interaction we had with Gove about build quality, at that point, it was 3 weeks ago, he was sending the 25-year, imminent 25-year environment plan away, so he could go away and think about planning. But that's not his remit, and that shows you why government doesn't work properly, because the 25-year environment plan is in a separate ministry to the delivery of planning policy, despite the fact that planning is the key way of delivering it. And that was always the case to some extent, but it's particularly bad at the moment because government's so hollowed out. Everyone hates the civil service, didn't they? That was a good knockabout argument, but they've all gone. So there's one town planner in Defra, one person with a town planning qualification in an entire ministry. And, you know, when people talk about there's too much civil servants, well, they're just playing wrong because we've lost the really heavyweight people who used to be, you know, there's nobody left of my generation or above with any planning qualifications in any part of government apart from Steve Quartermain. And he's the chief planner.
So will TCDA be in any position to challenge the new environmental planning policy under the climate change commitments?
So I think that we are, and other organisations are as well, but it's not as coordinated as it should be by any means. And I think the climate change agenda is one that, you know, because it's become so unpopular. I mean, look, there's been moral cowardice, hasn't there, all round on climate change. But in the last 7 years, there's been moral cowardice amongst NGOs and charities about how we've responded to it, to my great regret. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is we all knew what was going on in government. We knew what they were doing, and people were far too passive. Should have been screaming from the rooftops about deregulation. Ultimately, it wasn't until it cost people's lives that there was now an argument saying maybe a free market approach to the built environment is not the right one. Well, no kidding. We've been around long enough to see a free market approach to the built environment. Go and look what Manchester was like in the 1880s. You can go and see it. You know, we should have learned those lessons. But I think that there is hope around it, partly because, unfortunately for us, the impacts of climate change are happening faster. 25 years ago, I remember having these debates, and we all thought we had 25 to 40 years before. But actually, the impacts are happening faster than we'd imagined, and they're having a direct impact on the built environment in a much more extreme way, particularly surface water flooding. And that's making people sit up actually to whether or not some places are viable. And that's the future debate.
And do you think that, do you think that that is coming forward? Because I was promised by some chaps at the Environment Agency's science sort of sections that they were re-looking at, for example, the rainfall intensity figures, which was still that little table that they had assessed under the PPG, which was still based on the 1961 to 1990 baseline and was also national rather than regional or sub-regional. So we think that our climate change is getting worse here quicker than in some other areas because of our cold hills and atmospheric rivers and stuff like that. But I was promised that there was a reassessment of that, possibly on a more regional basis, coming out this autumn, but I haven't heard whether that's happening or not.
Well, there were 2 or 3 positive things around that. I mean, I know so far, obviously, you've got the new flood risk assessment maps, which are more sophisticated in factoring in flood defence. You've got the new flooding allowances and sea level rise allowances that they published last year. Yeah. And then there is a promise, because of the role that they took on the function of the UK Climate Impacts Programme, there's a promise of more sophisticated mapping further than that. So I think that's real. The Environment Agency is great, actually, but the problem is that they're data-rich, policy-poor. They're not allowed to comment on policy, and they're also being massively cut where it really counts. And people say it's great, we focused all the money in the Environment Agency in direct flood defence. Terrible mistake. You need people who can think, who will make policy, people who can understand the implications of it, as well as the money to do flood defence. So, but the point, just very quickly about that, is that in planning, we know we have a meter. I keep saying this to people in coastal communities. You've got a metre of sea level rise by 2080. It's about 4 millimetres a year that we can measure of sea level rise, and there's a lot of science building about after that point the sea will go on rising for 300 or 400 years. Please tell me then how you make many areas affected by coastal flooding resilient beyond 2100? And should you be building houses there? But there's a point.
This is sort of along the same kind of line. So we as planners trusted in the planning system when we bought our new build house in 2015. It was in flood zone 1 and it had gone through all the proper assessments, flood risk assessments. So we were confident that the process had been followed and was compliant with national policy. 8 months later, our timber framed new build house flooded in Desmond. So in the space of 5 years, a site that was classed as less than 1 in 1,000 chance a year of flooding. And in the new flood modelling, it's looking in 1 in 20 year outlines. So it's interesting insights you have in terms of planning authorities, how you can look at that longer term impact, because that's a major impact that happened just in the space of 5 years, and how we can be sure when we're allocating new sites, but giving permission that we really are looking far enough ahead.
I think it's really difficult. So much around. I mean, I feel like it's a really bitter story, particularly ironic when you're a planner.
Yes.
But the difficulty about that is that the way we've dealt with probabilities, and particularly it has been a really difficult box to undo. So one of the things this research found is we'd be much better off for planners and communities planning by rules of old-fashioned rules of thumb than we would be expressing probabilities as 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. We found it's completely meaningless. People had no idea what we meant. And then I started to think, if I was honest, did I really know what it meant? And I suddenly thought, actually, you know what? It's no use to me at all. I just need to know if that river's going to flood. And then we should plan for the worst. Always plan for the worst. It's the most human thing in the world. If you have a house in relation to fire, do you plan for the fact that it might not catch fire, but then it might? No, you need to plan for the worst.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, coastal communities would be better off planning for rules of thumb. It's going to be a meeting. It's going to be a meter there. Crack on. Do something. Your river is going to be 50-60% more probability of flooding to this amount. But that is still politically very difficult, and that's what's prevented it, because what that does is massively devalue property and land prices. And then the consequence of that is for insurance. So you pre-2012?
No.
So you're not
We're
part of the
not flood
insurance?
rate, no.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And
It
so,
was flood zone 1, so for us that it was a tick. We weren't considered to be at risk, and then
you are.
yeah.
So people are aware about the agreement on insurance, and post 2012, if you're in if your house is in a floodplain, you're not part of that pact. But what will undo places, and again I've been saying this for 20 years, what undoes places is investment in insurance. And that's beginning to operate because places are becoming vulnerable. So I did some work for Jersey, which, you all know Jersey? Okay, Jersey is an offshore tax haven, one of ours. And long story short, it's a lovely place, but very vulnerable to climate change. It's a harbour that faces southwest, and it's subject to storm surge, had no flood defence, and the town is lower than the level of the harbour wall. They haven't put the harbour wall up since the 1880s. They asked me to go over there because we were cheap, and I said, you don't need a consultant, just stand there and have a look. It's really self-evident. They're now getting massive amounts of global capital appearing in Jersey because they've got a resilience strategy that was in the Bahamas and those islands there that are completely incapable of making economically resilient to climate change. So this is and this is what frustrates me about, in some sense, local authority responses. Is at the heart of this is a social and economic as well as an environmental argument, illustrated brilliantly by what you just said. What should planning do? For me, what the planning system and local planning should do is fundamentally future-proof. They should think 50 to 100 years ahead, and the NPPF tells them to do that. It actually tells you to plan for that length of time, though nobody reads it. And then that's about thinking about where floodplains will be, where surface water intensity and temperature will be, and begin to completely redesign the urban concept. So that means everything from redesigning housing types to redesigning the design of estates and how they operate, building in green infrastructure and space, different design options to build resilience. Some people might live with water, some people might be happy to. Great for toddlers if you've got a foot of water in your front room, great deal of fun. Seriously though, some communities can deal with that. But when I was briefly, certainly looking at the Lake District in Carlisle, what struck me, this is a totally personal comment, is that you can be flooded out once and survive, flooded out twice and rebuild, flooded out 3 times and pull it back. But you know what? If you don't do something fundamental, this is just going to keep hitting people harder and harder until these places fall over economically and you're left with this extraordinary divide in this country. And the answer to that is the most extraordinary, exciting and important investment policy that this nation's ever had, which is a national strategy for building resilience. But you don't have that. You are the beginning, middle and end of the argument about England's climate change response. That is to say, the local plan and the local plan. Which is a bit scary, but it's all on you. No pressure.
Do you think there's some positive from what you said? I mean, if instead of just focusing on the climate change reduction targets, which is what I was being told to focus on back in 2010 to 15, we focus more on adaptation. So we take Cumbrian and Lancashire towns and we look at the water's going to be coming up the valley in the clouds, it's going to drop on the mountains and it's going to run down again. You know? We are going to have these towns that currently have very small drainage capacity because they haven't upgraded it since the 19th century. We've built more houses around the outside and we really push for adaptation for our towns and villages. Is that not the way forward?
Yeah,
Can we do that under the Climate Change Act? Can we say they need to have that in under the Climate Change Act?
In a way, the Climate Change Act is very powerful, isn't it? But it's much clearer on carbon reduction than it is on adaptation. And that's a problem because it sets out you must do this percentage reduction by then. On adaptation, it's more general and it's much more complicated, trying to build resilient communities. But essentially, as a strategy, yeah, we should get on with that. And it is important that everyone sees it as being really measures that communities can take. So the thing that made me laugh most in the last 10 years with joy was being on a study tour about Amsterdam dealing with temperature change. The city council gave people €20 and knocked a hole in the pavement outside their houses. With the €20, you go and buy a vine and you grow it at your house. And watching what the effect of that was on some streets on 5-storey concrete, not very nice social housing before, versus this kind of extraordinary green corridor that had evolved just 3 years later. Now this wasn't environment bling or green walls, it was growing vines up buildings. It was as basic as it would be.
Is it okay for the buildings?
Oh.
My question.
So that's a question that always comes up.
Yeah,
And when we were in Austria, you'd see a building of a wall. There'd be a wall here of an apartment block 7 stories high, and then, God forbid, there'll be one of those evil things, a tree, back there. And I'd stand next to it, and I'd go, you can't do that. There's like tree roots, and it's interesting that our culture is that nature is this might have a terrifying impact on our property value. The truth of it is that a vine, I mean ivy is a bit difficult, but these weren't that. They were kind of deciduous vines and also genuine grapevines as well. Yeah, they'll grow up a building, but these were concrete buildings and they had no problems whatsoever. Now maybe there's some awful consequence down the line, but for €20, for the price of tuppence halfpenny essentially for a city, this is why London's trying to do that become a national park initiative. Everyone thinks it's crazy, isn't it? London get designated as a national park. It's going to green itself. But if you look at the spaces in urban areas that could be green, if you look at Freiburg and the way they use their transport corridors and their trams, it's all green between the tracks. All of that potential there. That's why I say there's absolutely no technical barrier to delivering it. We could do it tomorrow. It's whether or not there's this collective will to do it and getting the strategy together.
And talking about collective will and culture, obviously through local plans we try and encourage active travel, but that just reminds me of recently there was a proposal to widen a footpath and create a cycleway footpath in Kendal, and the uproar it caused across the town that we could possibly be reducing one road from 2 lanes to 1 was just incredible, and the viciousness against pedestrians and cyclists. So there's huge cultural barriers to overcome, I think, in a lot of rural towns, maybe more so.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I can say this because I don't have your job, but people need a good slap. I'm sorry. And the reason I say this is that planners are not there to impose, but planners are there to offer a menu to communities about doing the right thing. And people in the last 7 years, it's okay now to do lots of things, isn't it, that we weren't meant to be doing 7 years ago. There's lots of attitudes that are out there. Because of the anti-car, you're all anti-car. Yeah, it's killing us. And I'm a user. But in relation to being in Doncaster 3 weeks ago with a group on public health and walkable street and obesity, 48% of the kids going from primary to secondary, which is year what? I always forget because I'm too old now. Year 6, 7. 48% were obese in that ward. And they are, because why? Partly because they're being taken out of their homes, put into a car and driven 600 yards off the estate to their school. Now look, you know, this is an argument about, this is why you can't just blame planners. If people are going to be that dumb, then we need to try and point that out and say, there's long-term effect on your children's health. Their generation will have shorter life expectancies, is the prediction, than ours, left to normal, if healthcare stays the same. That is an extraordinary indictment. So the point is that planning can do all of that. People say, oh, planning, what can it do? It can make people's lives better, it can encourage better transport options, provide people with better homes, create healthier people with better mental health and longer life expectancies, right? Or you can carry on, I mean, but you can't give up on that stuff. You know, that's fine, all right guys. The most successful pedestrianisations in the country were all opposed outright. It's a job of persuasion. When planning was at its height in the 40s, 50s and did some fantastic good things like designate the odd national park and build some quite good housing, then there was a much bigger argument in the cinemas. There were films, mainstream films about planning and housing. But all there is on the television now is Escape to the Country, isn't it? Programmes about why planners are crap. Well, grand design, but it's all about individualism. But what there isn't out there is a politician who will stand up there and say, not just here's a single policy, this is what your community will look like. This is the benefit. This is the benefit. We're not trying to make your life difficult by halving this road. We're trying to save your child's life. We're trying to make this place a healthier environment for people to live in. You need to be that. Trouble is, planners hard to be that strong. You need political backing.
I know you were talking just before about transport and stuff and getting around is, I don't know if that's part of planning anyway, but one thing that as a society we've forgotten is, one of these things, bus pass, is a climate change, carbon reduction issue rather than benefit to me because I'm old. And they think, oh, they take the benefit. It's not about benefiting me. It's about reducing my use of cars and bringing pollution into Lancaster or Preston or Chorley, wherever. Been lost in the movement from when we were first issued. It is, I've had it a long time now.
No, I mean, all of those policies together and planning, actually, when you think about how community evolves, back to these questions, isn't it? You think about planning so often reduced in scope, but the question about how we're going to live, that's the heart of it. The question you're asking in planning is essentially, how are we going to live? And I think how you do that, because I'm aware that we've got about 1 minute left, how you do that, okay, it's not easy at the moment, but honestly, I think, I have honestly been through utter despair about whether it's worth going on with it. But then you walk around the European city, you walk around Freiburg, you walk around Copenhagen, you go, actually this is just like falling off a log to most of the European countries. And it's too important actually for us to kind of have a sense of giving up on it. But I fear, I'll leave you with this thought, that it doesn't matter what I think about planning or what you think about planning, this challenge is coming down the road. It really is. So we are going to have to organise ourselves. And unfortunately, it may well be it will take a few more hits, serious hits, before we reach that point. And then the politicians will be screaming about how we solve this problem. We have to kind of be ready for that, I think.
We've got to solve it cooperatively and cooperatively
we
is
have.
the way the planning works.
Yeah, we have.
Any other desperate things that people should draw it to a close there? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah.